Keely, and my video today is on how bill drafters prepare to amend or repeal statutes. Like other forms of drafting legislation in California, when you prepare to amend or repeal an existing statute, there are several steps for a bill drafter to take. I found some helpful guidance in this regard from the graduate degree in legislative drafting program from Athabasca University in Canada. To them, the following steps are what a bill drafter should follow. The first step is research the topic and existing statutes. For example, the drafter should review existing legislation and laws that cover the matters that will be dealt with by a proposed amendment or repeal. And all of the affected statutes need to be clearly identified by the drafter. After reviewing the existing statutes, the drafter needs to decide whether the existing law should be retained or changed or repealed in part or in whole. And this the bill drafter generally determines by understanding whether the proposed amendment or its repeal will be consistent with the existing statutory scheme, or if some of the existing laws need to be changed in order to be consistent with the new legislation. Of course, if existing law is incompatible, then it can no longer be retained. When amending existing law, the drafter really needs a complete picture of the new proposed statutory scheme in order to work out how to change the existing law to produce the desired results for the author. Thereafter, the drafter needs to understand how properly to implement the proposed changes, again, in the context of the existing statutory scheme, so that once amended, that statutory scheme is consistent and set forth in a coherent manner. The second step for the bill drafter then is to plan. Here, when proposing a repeal, the drafter needs to determine which existing laws are not going to be retained. Some provisions may have to be retained, or some you might want to retain, but they'll probably have to be reenacted with substantial amendments sometimes. Other provisions may be carried over into the new statutory scheme, but should they be repealed from their existing placement? And then when proposing amendments, the bill drafter needs to determine which sections of law have to be amended and in what manner, in what form those amendments should take place. When proposing amendments to existing law, the drafter needs to work through all the relevant sections of law that are likely to be amended, as well as other provisions of statutes that might be impacted by these newly amended ones. The bill drafter needs to identify which provisions should be changed to give full effect to the new legislative proposal. And in some instances, because the amendments might be substantial in nature, the bill drafter may decide not to amend existing statutes, but instead propose to amend and replace existing law. Now, when working through the provisions of law that need to be altered, the bill drafter also needs to consider whether any sort of transitional or savings provisions are required. And these are basically used to preserve necessary provisions of existing law and any pre-existing, maybe vested rights. Savings provisions are usually used when dealing with a repealed statute. The transitional provisions can be used with both repeals as well as amendments, and they essentially put into place some temporary rules that will apply. The savings or transitional rules can be part of the statutory scheme, but they can also be standalone code sections of their own, which means they would be separate provisions of the bill that enact some amending or repealing provisions. The third and final step, of course, is to actually draft. When you're going to draft repeal provisions, you obviously want to use express provisions that clearly identify the provisions of existing law that are being repealed by the bill. And this means that precise language should be used as a direct statement. For example, a bill might say section 1234 of the Civil Code is repealed. You also need to use separate sections for repealing and do them in the order, in numeric order when you're repealing multiple code sections. The other thing in drafting amendments for the bill drafter to consider is what approach to take. Again, what new provisions might be added, whether there will be a partial repeal or a full repeal of revisions. The bill drafter also needs to make amendments by express provisions, and the bill drafter should use consistent language throughout the new statutory scheme and remember other drafting principles like present tense and avoiding any unnecessary, duplicative, or overly legalistic words as well when they are drafting amendments or repeals.